Welcome back to the last session or the last lesson on the story of the Old Testament. Today's lesson is going to be about the return from exile. Following God isn't always easy. We realize that. And for the people in today's lessons, the events happened at a time that was so wonderful for them. They finally were out of exile, but it was also a challenging time for Judah. They were returning from exile, but they faced a lot of opposition. And as we're going to see in the last part, it wasn't only the rebuilding of the walls and the temple in Jerusalem that they had difficulty. They also needed to stop mingling pagan gods with their worship of God. But despite all of these struggles, we still can learn a lot from Judah and how they faced the challenges that came before them, outside as well as inside. Because we've talked before that your outside appearance often shows that you're being a very good Christian, but your motivation on the inside is not always the same. Have you ever had to tackle a big reconstruction project? Was there any help? Was it difficult? Did things go smoothly? Sometimes we have to do it all by ourselves, and sometimes we can have help. But today's lesson is about a reconstruction project in Israel of rebuilding their temple as well as the walls of Jerusalem, because they had been neglected for decades. The lesson will conclude with a call to restoration of God's people. They had restored all of the buildings, but they still had some work to do. We're going to talk about Ezra and Nehemiah, and they didn't come on the scene until almost 100 years after Judah had returned to Jerusalem and had come out of captivity. But this reminds us that God often gives us a plan for our lives, but it doesn't always take place immediately because God's timing is different than our timing. But God, if He made you a promise and He has a plan, His plan will be completed. But if we must be in tune with His will, because we can experience His blessings and His promises in our time, but sometimes it goes to the time of our children. Just like David, he knew the temple would be built. God promised him that. But because of his indiscretions, he had the promise, but he never saw the completion. And although Ezra and Nehemiah appear in the first half of the New Testament, they have things that they recorded that actually take place in the end of the first 39 books of the Scripture. This is because the Old Testament is not written chronologically. It's written according to genre or categories, with history following the law. And we know that the Israelites had a lot of history and a lot of discouragement. We must keep in focus that all of that sadness was a part of what made them who they were in the history of God's people. Because up to this point, they had been told time and time again by God, or warned of the punishment that would come to them if they didn't reject sin and come back to Him. And at this time, when Nehemiah and Ezra's prophecies were coming to pass, both the north and the south parts of Israel, the kingdoms of Israel, had long fallen, and they were already coming back from that punishment. The tragic warnings of so many prophets over so many centuries had finally come to pass. Yet with this return from Babylon's exile, hope had been renewed. And now, however, just as God's promises seemed to be progressing, they'd had the punishment, it was going to be a new beginning. They see more struggles to come. This first section is called The Temple is Being Rebuilt. God's sovereignty worked out His plan. Perhaps you've heard the statement that God moves in mysterious ways, His wonders to perform. Well, that's not a Bible quote. It's a quote from William Cowper's a writing he made in the 18th century. But it applies to many circumstances in which especially this one where the exiles from Judah began their task of rebuilding the temple. God's sovereignty is a difficult concept to understand because God's sovereignty means that He is supreme. He is the ultimate authority. He's the only one that we should obey. Yet, He gives us the choice of whether we obey Him or not. He's not like most kings or leaders that if He's the only one you can follow, then He requires that. It's a demand. But God does not demand that you follow Him. He allows you to make your own choice, even though He is sovereign. He also sometimes, though, will use unlikely people or circumstances to accomplish that will of helping you make that choice to follow Him. And that's the case in today's lesson. As we begin our look at they call it exilic or post-exile books, it's helpful to understand the timeline of events. Remember, there were 3 waves. The first wave of exile was when they took the leaders. The second, they took skilled people. And then the rest of the people when they destroyed and burned Jerusalem. The first wave came 605 BC, and the final wave was in 586. So it was a period of 10 years. Well, then in 538 BC was when the Persian Empire was taken over by Cyrus, or the Persian Empire regime took over Babylon, where they were in exile, and Cyrus was the king at that time. And this is all confirmed in biblical context. In fact, they found something, it looks like a rolling pin, but it was actually a clay cylinder in which they wrote in the edicts or the accomplishments of Cyrus. So we have a confirmed relic that they found in an archaeological dig in around 1879 that confirms many of the achievements of Cyrus. And it also tells us about other people groups that were released at that time too, that apparently were in captivity in Babylon, that he released them as well. But we are concerned about the Israelites. Scripture gives us a true reason, though, behind the policy of Cyrus. It said, I'll just read it to you. In Ezra chapter 1, verse 2, it said, "This is what Cyrus, king of Persia, said. The Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and He has appointed me to build a temple for Him at Jerusalem in Judah." Yes, all of that is true. Yes, He had all the kingdoms. God had all the kingdoms. He just allowed Cyrus to be over them. And this is a case where God moves in mysterious ways, His wonders to perform. He moved through Cyrus to make this edict of allowing the Israelites to go back and build the temple. So God was really using Cyrus in order to accomplish His plan. And you can read about this in the prophecies of Isaiah as well as Jeremiah. Isaiah 41 and verses 2 and 25 both allude to this. And Cyrus is mentioned by name in Jeremiah. This is 200 years before Cyrus ever ruled, and his very name of being the king at the time they would come out of exile was mentioned. Jeremiah 51, 1 and 11 spoke that of the fall of Babylon, and then it talked about the return of the exiles, and then it talked about the restoration of the temple. But the dominant theme that you will see in Jeremiah is that God is sovereign, and He is the one that is in control of all the nations. And although Cyrus issued the edict, and it's clear in both Isaiah and Jeremiah that God is the one that was orchestrating these events. And God can use any way. Sometimes we think it's really strange the way He accomplishes His plan. But God can accomplish His plan in any means that He desires. And that's what we must keep in focus, that He can and rest assured in the fact that if it's a plan that God promised, it's going to happen. And we know that there's many things, many prophecies that were made that we already know have come to pass. But if you hear from God and you really feel that God is making you a promise, then you can take it to the bank. And we're going to go on to talk about many ways that the enemy comes against you and makes you think, no, you didn't really hear from God. You just thought you did. This remains true even with the opposition that we find and that the people found when they that came up against in Ezra, that they talked about the many things that they come up against. It says, even as the people of Judah were in exile, God had a plan even at the beginning, even before they went into exile, of their redemption. And it was foretold by prophets. The prophets told them, the day will come, you will not be in exile, and you will be giving back all your fortunes and your wealth. And that was, many, many, many years. Well, they were in exile 70 years, and he told them about that even before then. It said, have you ever experienced a time when it seemed like God had just forgotten about you? God didn't even know who you were anymore. Yet later you could see the hand of God on your life through everything that you went through. Well, Cyrus may have believed that he was making a benevolent policy on his own, but he was actually operating within God's plan. Delay is not the same as failure. Sometimes maybe you feel like God called you when you were a youth and you were at camp and God told you were going to be a missionary. Well, here you are, age, say 40, and you have not gone to Africa yet. Delay does not mean failure. And just like when the temple was being rebuilt, the opposition came against them and they were able to convince even the king to stop the work. King Cyrus had told them that they should go back and do this, but yet who he put in charge in Judah was convinced that no, they weren't supposed to, even though the king had told them to. However, God's will is ultimately going to be accomplished, and the temple was completed. But sometimes there are unavoidable reasons why you are delayed in completing God's mission in your life. And it's unavoidable. It's nothing you had control over. Sometimes you did make the wrong choice, but God will accomplish his will. As we surrender to him, his work will always be done in our lives. Zerubbabel was who was governing Judah during this restoration of the temple and rebuilding the temple and the walls. And he allowed it to go ahead in robustly. The people were joyously completing the work, and the main number of the workers were Levites. And if you'll remember, all priests were Levites, but not all Levites were priests. So there was mixed emotions. Remember when they came back from Babylon, there was a new generation, children that had been born. And in that time, they could be 70 years old and never have seen the old Jerusalem. But then we had many people that chose to come back to see their old Jerusalem because that's where they had come from. That was home for them. So the new ones came back, and the fact that they'd heard about this wonderful temple, they were jubilantly rebuilding the temple, and they were very happy about it, dancing and praising the Lord that they finally were able to do this. But yet we have the older Levites that were very sad at the rebuilding. That's because they remembered the splendor of Solomon's temple, and they knew from the building of this foundation that there was no way this temple was going to be that glorious and that sumptuous of wealth. And so they were sad. But this didn't last long, because as they were building, opposition came against them. As you remember, some of the people from outlying areas took over Jerusalem and kind of moved into there, but they neglected it. This was not their chosen city. But they moved in and they said, let us help. And they were Samaritans. And as you know, the Jews and the Samaritans did not get along. So the Samaritans came in and they said, let us help them build the temple. I can see you don't have as many workers as you need, and let us help. Well, Zerubbabel, who was being led by God and the king, said, no, I cannot allow that. And so that made the people very sad, very disappointed and disheartened, because they wanted to build the temple, but they really didn't have the manpower they needed. And here we had people volunteering to help them, and Zerubbabel, their king, their governor, was saying, no, you can't do that. The reason for that was just like when the Israelites came across the Red Sea and they were inhabiting Canaan, God said he did not want their lineage, their bloodline being defiled. They were Jewish, and if they married the people that were already there in Canaan, that they would take on a lot of their idols and their foreign ways. And they, people always say, oh no, I won't give in on my ways, but God knew. And that was the very same way when they came back to Judah, is that they didn't want to dilute their bloodline. And if the Samaritans started helping, they would form relationships. Relationships would lead to marriage. Marriage would lead to children, and they would not be pure Jews. So they had to refuse their help as a result. And it's well known, and all the scholars believe that this was just an attempt by Satan to dilute the bloodline. And in rebuilding the temple, he knew the people would want help. So this resulted in them just delaying the rebuilding of the temple for a while. Well, Xerxes was king and he got a letter when the people started rebuilding the temple. And the letter he got was from those Samaritans that had been refused help. And they wrote to Xerxes, which is, they were in Persia at the time, and Xerxes was. And he wrote a letter because he was still king over them. They just appointed a governor in Judah. They didn't have a king yet. And he wrote a letter, and he said, do you know that those people you sent back to rebuild the temple are rebuilding the walls as well? And if you allow them to be successful in rebuilding those walls, it's going to prevent you from access, and you will not have control. They will elect a king, and you'll lose all control over them. So, construction of the walls stopped. Then again, we have Darius. It was under Darius that the returnees were allowed to complete their temple, and it was completed at that time. And they had the full support of the king and all the money they needed, anything they needed. He even put out a law that said, if you prevent them from rebuilding this temple in any way, there will be consequences. So it was completed in the 6th year of Darius's reign, around 515 BC. So this was very much in line with what Jeremiah prophesied 70 years before the captivity. God's word was unfolding just as he had declared. Well, the initial joy of God's favor was interrupted by several years of opposition. Has there ever been a time in your life when God's direction for you seemed to be very clear, and then the circumstances delayed the fulfillment? Like I said before, there can be good reasons for why it was delayed, and there may not have been, but it will be completed. 20 years had passed from the edict of Cyrus telling the Israelites they could go home and rebuild their temple before they completed the temple. And in that 21 years it took for the temple to be built, 15 years of that time was wasted listening to what the people said. That was not relevant, but they listened to them, even though they knew the king and God told them to go back and rebuild that temple. The books and the seminars that we go to on leadership, there's always books. In fact, I've just spent the last 2 days in leadership and seminars about Christian women's conferences. And so while that training is very valuable, and anyone that's aspiring to be a leader can learn from that, and they should learn as much as they can. The first qualification, though, in being a leader in the Christian or spiritual realm is that you have the call of God on your life. And we're going to talk about Nehemiah, and he definitely had the call of God on his life. But he knew that. He knew God had called him. And he stayed humble, and he stayed submissive to God's will. He was not deterred by by the opposition that came against him or the tasks that God gave him. Because sometimes God can give you a task and you think, I am not capable of doing this. But if God calls you, he will equip you. So we have the story of Nehemiah returning to Jerusalem. Now, what had happened prior to that is Xerxes, the very one that had received the letter about them building the wall, and he said, don't build the wall. While he was still king, and uh, Nehemiah went to him and he said, "Why are you so sad?" And Nehemiah said, "I've gotten word from my people that the walls of Jerusalem are just broken down, and it's just an embarrassment, and it's so sad that we would have our beautiful city of Jerusalem with its wonderful temple, but we have no walls to support us." And he said, I just feel I need to go back and help them. And the king said, "Then you shall. Here's all the money you need. Let me know if you need any more, and you can go back and build those walls, because you're right, you should." So several decades after that time, the time of Zerubbabel, and roughly during the time of Ezra, is when this happened. This was in 444 BC. So this was 100 years after they had gone back to build the temple. And so, as we said in the beginning, something had delayed them, but God still had a plan, and the plan was to rebuild the temple and the walls of Jerusalem. So it said 3 days after his return, he got there and kind of looked around to see what was going on. And he also was very tired from his journey. But then he got the feeling that there was a lot of opposition. And he was very wise, and he knew he had the full support of God and the king, and so he wasn't in a real hurry. He took his time, and he went out at night. He found some men that he knew that he could trust. He looked at the walls of Jerusalem, decided what he needed to do, made a plan for how he was going to accomplish building those walls. And then he went in and told the people. He had two teams. He had one team of builders, and then he had another team of protectors. So while the ones that were building, they were protected against any opposition that might occur. He was personally concerned with this situation. He said in verse 17, I think you have that in your lesson. It said, "So the elders and the Jews continued to build and prosper under the preaching of Haggai." Is that the? No, he said, this is I read that in Ezra. Nehemiah says, "I also told them about the gracious hand of my God on me and what the king had said to me. Those who survived the exile are back in the providence and are in great trouble and disgrace. The walls of Jerusalem are broken down, and its gates have been burned by fire." And so that's what the people were telling him, and that's what he was observing. And so after assessing the conditions, he pointed out that he had the favor of the king, as I read, and of God. And the opposition told him, "You're going to be in big trouble with the king, because we already wrote to him once, and he's in full support of us." And that's when Nehemiah told them, "No, I have the support of God, but I also have the support of the king. And you have no place and no authority, because we will complete this." It said the sturdy, effective walls characterized the security. If you were a kingdom and you didn't have sturdy walls, then you didn't have good security and stability. And that was kind of a rule. That's what people looked at back in that time. And it really was a disgrace for Jerusalem. This was a great city. They said they were the chosen people, and their city was the chosen kingdom of God. And here they found themselves in a state of embarrassment because their walls were down. So it says, just as it was with the rebuilding of the temple, there was great opposition to Nehemiah, but God had given him full support. And Nehemiah said calmly, "You have nothing in this. We will succeed." So, but he had protectors anyway. Nehemiah 3 is where you can read about this. We don't have time to go into it, but it recounts the specifics of his plan that he set out. He had a specific responsibility for various families, because various families were good at laying brick or whatever their strengths were. He chose those families, which in turn made the people personally involved in the project. And it motivated them to want to finish this work. And that's just like it is today. You may think that I don't have the skills. I'm not a preacher and I'm not a teacher, so I'm not needed in the church. And that's not true. Each person does their part. Every strength God has called you to, whatever you are, it shows that the work of God needs all people from all walks of life. When God's people obey Him and begin to accomplish His work, there often will be opposition, but God is greater than any opposition. Because after that enemy of Nehemiah saw that the wall was completed in only 52 days, and just pull it up on Google and see how huge this wall is, how tall the wall is, and to say that they finished it with very few workers in 52 days, because remember, half of them were protectors. You'll see how amazing it was. And so the people that were against them, they saw how amazing it was. They could see, they recognized that God had brought the success to the people, and as a result, they were intimidated. Through God's help, as we said, Nehemiah's strategy and leadership was successful. In only 52 days, he completed this very difficult, complex project. So as such, it spoke to Nehemiah's qualities as a leader and a man of God. He was confident, he was confident when he went into this that he was going to succeed. Even when the opposition came against him before he ever started, he said, no, I'm going to succeed. I have the support of God and the king, and so that's all I need. He had a vision for this success, and he made it a priority of calling many other people in to help him, to participate in the work, to share in the vision as a leader. Nehemiah never sought personal gain, though. He had all of this support. He was confident, but he was not arrogant. The people were confident in volunteering to help him too, because they could see he was a man of God and he went in with confidence. So it was a leader they felt that they could follow. Verse 16 is especially helpful today for anyone who's facing opposition. The opposing leaders who sought to foil the plans of Nehemiah were afraid, and they hastened. And they were disheartened, The literal expression in the Bible that tells us that they were afraid and disheartened says they fell much in their own eyes. You've heard this before when it says lean not into your own understanding, but acknowledge God in all your ways. And that's Proverbs 3, 5, and 6. And then verse 7 says, be not wise in your own eyes. Don't think you know everything. And here we hear it again, and they fell much in their own eyes. They knew that the success of this project had come from God. Today, the strategy of our enemy, of our souls, is to convince us to fear the opposition and to doubt the reality of God's voice and empowerment. That's to say, you feel God's called you to do something, and you feel strength, and you know God wanted you to do this, or that God has promised the fulfillment of this. Yet you have somebody coming against you and making you doubt. When a spiritual leader is confident in God and sincerely seeks Him for direction, there can be great expectation that God is going to bring success to the endeavor. So when you're confident and you go through with that in believing it, you won't doubt. But the opposition is, I liken this to a bully. Bullies come to you in all boldness and confidence, and they make statements that they can't back up. But they come to you in such boldness and confidence that you believe them. But if you were to require them to prove what they're saying when it's in opposition to what you thought was right, they couldn't do it. But they know that you won't oppose them or challenge them on this. So sometimes you just need to believe. That's what it's saying. If you know God talked to you, don't doubt it. He either did or he didn't. And if you're not sure, you need to pray about it and get that confidence so that you can proceed with boldness and confidence in what you're doing. And like we said with Nehemiah, the people were willing to follow him because he was confident. He knew that he was doing God's will. I want to show you something we had in our packet that we can't go over in person. But it says Leadership Lessons from Nehemiah. And it gives the scripture verses. And it's in the 7 chapters of Nehemiah. But I want you to look at this. And it's things that make a good leader. If you'll look at this, you'll see all the things that he did that made him a good leader. And we just discussed just about all of them. About him involving the people in what they did. Make sure it wasn't upside down. But he listened to people. He spent time in prayer. He chose his time carefully. Remember, he surveyed the area, got his plan together, then he presented it when he knew all of the opposition that may come against him and knew that he might require some protectors. But just look at those and think about those. They're very good things to incorporate in your life, whether you're a leader in the church or not. God calls his people to obey. Malachi was a priest and a prophet to God's people. The exiles had returned to their homeland. They had rebuilt the temple. They had rebuilt the walls of Jerusalem. But God told them they were not finished. What else do we need to do? We've done everything we thought we were supposed to do. He said, no, you fell short of the commands that I gave you. You're giving me blemished sacrifices. When you worship, you've dishonored me with your marriage relationships, because some of the people, the Samaritans that came into town, some of the Israelites did marry the Samaritans. So it had defiled or diluted their pure Jewish breed. So they did do that. And he said, and you have withheld your tithe from me. Malachi warned them of the judgments to come. He also spoke that there was a Messiah coming. Eventually, and so this was always talked about, that there was a Messiah coming. But he said he will usher in a new covenant. Now, the book of Malachi is the last book. As I told you, this is the last lesson we have in the Old Testament, and Malachi is the last book. So we don't know, but it could have been the final book that was written. Like I said, they were not in chronological order. So we're assuming it was the last book written. But the time between Malachi and the New Testament, the first book is Matthew, is 400 years. And this is referred to as the intertestament time, but it's 400 years, 4 centuries. Malachi contains a stern warning reminiscent to the prophets of the 7th and 8th, or 8th and 7th, because that's how it went before Christ. We had the 8th century before we had the 7th century, according to that timing. But that was the time of Israel, when we had the north and the south, and they were being warned of the judgment that would come against them, and did come against them. And here was Malachi giving them the very same warning. Israel's idolatry had begun soon after Exodus at Mount Sinai. Remember, they were worshiping the golden calf. When Malachi 3:7, it alludes to that same thing, that sad history. It even says, ever since the time of your ancestors, you have turned away from my decrees, and you have not kept them. It seems the people, when they came out of exile, they had every good intention of becoming a different people. But they had become spiritually apathetic in that century that followed the return. So that's why we have the delay, that 100 years before Nehemiah and Ezra came on the scene. As a result, the Lord called them to return to him. The instruction regarding their tithe in verse 10 that they were keeping away from him was very familiar. Back then, you knew you needed to tithe. Such instruction was grounded in the law of Moses, so they'd always known about the importance of tithing. The practice of tithing was recognized in everything. Their fruit, their livestock, their produce, anything they had of the land was a gift from God, and tithing was expected of the people. And not to do so was stealing from God, because they said tithing was God. Everything you had was from God. And so verses 11 and 12 reaffirm that promise, noting that the blessings of being healthy and being in a healthy covenant relationship with God adherence to the Old Testament law brought fertility and prosperity to the land. A return to the Lord would result in protection of Israel's crops. Then all of the nations would recognize Israel had been blessed. Well, there's a lot saying there. God was saying, in tithing to me, and the sacrifices they made of the people, and in their marriage relationships, all three of those, he said, all three of those, I will prosper you, I will prosper your crops, but you have to serve only me, not other idols. Because after the exile, God had said, you've left me, so I want you to come back. And what the people said was, we're here. We came back out of exile. Where are we supposed to go if we're not, if it's not Jerusalem? Come back to what? And that was their very words. They didn't see that they were out of the will of God. God says, if you give to God, I will bless what you have left after you give what you're to give to me. So he will prosper what you have left. But if you do not give to God, he will curse what you have left. And what you have, you can't even take advantage of because it will be cursed and won't go as far as you had planned for it to go. And so that saying, the rich get richer, the poor get poorer, really is a reality in God's kingdom, because he blesses them, when the rich, when they give to him, and the poor get poor because he curses what they have. A remnant turns to God. We noted earlier that the fear of God was the key theme in the Old Testament. Remember, it says that the key theme is having knowledge and wisdom and understanding. Yet in a world today that's often apathetic towards the Lord, we must be careful to maintain a proper attitude towards a submission to God. This means looking to him, trusting to him for everything that we have. Lean not to your own understanding, knowledge God in everything you do, in every situation of your life. Now, we know a remnant or a portion of the people did respond positively to God's invitation to trust him, to come back to him. Malachi 3:16 records that those who feared the Lord came together and the Lord heard them. And there was great joy in recognizing that the Lord had counted them as his treasured possession. You are his treasured possession. And it doesn't matter if you go to a church or just a Bible study group where there are just a few people. To God, that's a church. In Matthew 18:20, it says, where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name. So if your little grouping is in God's name, he will be in the midst of you. You are his precious treasure. It said, in a world where family relationships are often strained and broken, you can be in the family of God. You have a loving Father, and he loves his children. This new generation that came out of the exile were committed to be different, but they weren't. They said, we're going to stand in contrast to those previous generations. We're not going to be idol worshipers. And remember last week, that's how our lesson started. Well, boy, if I'd known, all that they'd been through, I know I would not have been one of the idol worshipers. I would have taken heed when they told me what was going to happen. But like we said, you have to focus on the fact that those idols promised fertility to their family and their crops. It told them that we will protect you against the rain and the storms. And so that was their livelihood. So they didn't stop worshiping God. They just mingled pagan worship with their worship of God. And that was a problem. Mingling false religions and idolatry with true worship of God was a problem with God's people throughout history. They often confused the boundaries between what actions and beliefs belonged in their faith and the ones that did not. And that's what we were talking about, the idols that they saw for protection. They didn't realize God could protect their crops as well. And it made it clear, God made it very clear that judgment would come to the evildoers, but goodness would come to those who were faithful just to him, a promise that endures among God's people to this very day. And that's something I have said throughout all of these chapters. This Bible, even the Old Testament, is still relevant to today. Many prophecies in the Old Testament have not been realized yet. We are still realizing some of the prophecies, and some of them won't happen until this world ends. Although God had sent his people into exile as a punishment for their disobedience to him, he never forgot about them. God will never forget about you, no matter what compromising position you get into. God's not forgotten about you. He doesn't desire that any should perish. He sent leaders and prophets all through the ages to warn them, yet they still did not fully worship him. But God is gracious, and his plan is to send the Messiah that would endure. When we go through difficult times, we may feel that God has forsaken us, but his plan is still taking place. God's timetable is much different from yours, but we can trust him. We can always trust him that it will be completed. So think about that this week and find someone to encourage to trust God in the midst of their difficulties. We have a lot of difficulties going on with the COVID and the racial injustice. And this election that's coming up. But we can find a way to be encouraged, and you can be that instrument of God, just like Cyrus was. You may be one of the unlikely people that God uses to bring someone to Christ, and you can be the one that helps that person. And evaluate your own devotion to God. Are there ways in which you are robbing God in your worship? Pray that you will worship him sincerely and humbly. And when you are blessed, still be humble and submissive, because everything you have comes from God. And that's one of the problems the Israelites had. They had begun relishing in their temple and all the things that God was blessing them with, and coming back out of exile, that they forgot that it wasn't because of them. It was because of God that they had what they had, and that God's plan was continuing to unfold, as you will see in your life. And as we said earlier in our lesson, when you submit to him, then you see more of God's plan unfolding. But oftentimes you won't see it in your lifetime if you don't submit to God. So here's to starting a new unit next week, which would progress on to the New Testament. The Messiah comes, and that's what our lesson will be for next week. So have a great week. We'll talk to you later.